Hi, I'm Jason Mefford, and a lot of people, or I consider myself an enigma. And when you listen on further, you will see why. So I do a lot of different things and love Phil and am happy to be here today. So I host many different podcasts, actually. I run different coaching programs for people in corporate work, but I'm also a very spiritual guy. So I do some of that as well. So we might get into that a little bit later. But anyway, happiness to me, or at least what I'm going to say today, is love and gratitude. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as to why I see that that's what happiness is for me.
Yes, Mr. Enigma. I think that's a good word for you, by the way, Jason. I
Well, it
think
is.
that
I mean,
is,
yeah, so many of my friends are like, what the hell do you even do? It's like, well, I mean, my podcast this week on Jamming with Jason is Don't Fence Me In. Right, that
right.
song, Don't Fence Me In, because it's like I don't like to be put in a box. I like to do lots of things. I know about a lot of different things. But what's interesting is like on the Fire and Earth podcast I do with Kathy that you've been on, we just did an episode called FedEx Driver.
Okay.
And it's because we both view ourselves like a FedEx driver. We deliver lots of packages to people. We don't really care how, what's in the box, but we're delivering happiness, peace, whatever it happens to be. And it can be in a lot of different modalities, right? But it's like underlying what is it that you do. So like Phil, I mean, happiness, right? I mean, you're delivering happiness. And it can be on a video like this. It can be in your emails that you send out. It's lots of different ways. But ultimately, when you peel it back, what are you doing? You're trying to help people be happy. You're trying to be happy yourself, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's so interesting because you talk about love and gratitude there at the jump, which I
Yeah.
think is great. Let's start with gratitude because love is a longer conversation and we'll get into that, I promise.
Yeah.
But talk to me, why does gratitude matter to you? How does that help you bust your burnout and overcome and embrace happiness?
Well, one way is, you kind of had asked before, what's a good piece of advice or a bad piece of advice. And I think I've received a lot of good advice, and depending on where I'm at in life, depends on which one I kind of focus or work on. But one that really sits with me a lot is, and I'll explain how this ties into it, right? Is where you are, where your attention is. Okay, so I'll say that again. You are where your attention is. And so that simple phrase actually has a lot of different meanings, but the tie in for what we're talking about today is, and how it even ties back to burnout too, right? Is I get to choose where I place my attention, right? So
Yeah.
where I choose to place my attention is where I am, and it is how I feel as well. And so I don't know if you're familiar with David Hawkins' scale of consciousness that he did.
Nope.
Okay, it kind of lists. He did a bunch of research, and it kind of lists normal human emotions in a way. It doesn't line up exactly because he was looking at it from a place of consciousness, kind of in a Jungian psychological standpoint, but looked at, and he kind of logarithmically came up with this scale of, hey, if you're feeling shame, that's a really low vibration frequency emotion, right? And so you know how you feel if you feel ashamed, right? It
Right.
sucks, right? And you can move from there all the way up to the top one that he had on his scale was called enlightenment. And along the way, a lot of the things that we see as or think of as emotions are kind of included in there. Like anger is one, right? Kind of neutrality or indifference, love, gratitude, some of these different things. And so for me, what I really work on and practice is, if I'm ever not feeling the way I want to feel, then I move my emotions, I move my frequency by changing my awareness of where I am. Okay. And so what this can look like is, let's say I'm feeling really shitty. right? Somebody just shamed me and I'm buying into it for a little bit. I'm feeling ashamed for something, let's say. And I have to stop once I recognize that, once I place attention on that, right? Then I can say, well, hold it. I don't need to feel ashamed for that. I release those feelings of shame and I replace it with something else. And for me, one of the easiest ways to do that is to get to a place of gratitude, right? And turn it around, transmute whatever it is that we're going through. So let's say again, I felt ashamed. And it's like, oh, I release the shame and I replace it with gratitude. I'm so grateful for this person who made me feel ashamed, and for me to now learn from that feeling and be able to move to a place of gratitude. I'm so grateful that that person triggered me, right? I'm grateful to them. And then, because that's for me is an easier place to get to. I think we can all understand what it feels like to feel gratitude. And then I try to move it to a place of love. Like, I'm so grateful for that person and I love them unconditionally for who they are. I may not agree with them, but I love them as a fellow human being, as a fellow, cosmic journeyer on this process. And I'm grateful that they're in my life and are teaching me lessons, right? And so for me, that's why when I can get to a place of gratitude and I can express that gratitude, that person usually feels good. I feel good. And that gets me back to a place of happiness, well-being, right? Because I know a lot of times everybody says we want to be happy, but it's like, but what is happiness really? Psychology defines it as subjective well-being. And so it can be different for each person. But for me, if I can calm myself down, if I can get to a place of gratitude and to a place of feeling love, then I'm happy. I'm at peace, right? Which to me equates with a lot of what happiness is, at least for me, is feeling that peace.
Hmm. So, how did you come upon this, Jason? How did you figure this out for you?
Years and years of study. No, it's I've studied psychology for a lot of years, 25 years plus probably. Read lots of things, and so I've got kind of that side of it, the side from a coaching perspective, right? And kind of the flipping around like Landmark Forum did. Instead of have, do, be, they flip it around so it's be, have, do. So once you be this way, then you do these things and you have these things, right? And also kind of for my spiritual journey too. I mean, some of the ancient teachings that kind of go along with that and people who have mentored me, I started to see, right, in all these different areas. And that's why I'm kind of an enigma, because I like to look at all these different areas and try to find correlations and connections between these various traditions, theories, knowledge bases, whatever you want to call them, and then kind of pick out for me and merge them together into something that works, that's practical for me, and that I can share with other people as well.
So you came across that then, definitely when you were in accounting and compliance, right? I mean, that was the whole. That
Oh
was
yeah.
the was that the beginning of that?
Well, part of it, I mean, like I said, I learned really easily. I mean, I was one of these geeks where when I was 12, I was reading Forbes magazine every week. I had a Franklin Day Planner. I was listening to Steve and reading Stephen Covey books and Brian Tracy and all this kind of stuff. So I've always had this desire for kind of self-learning and everything. And psychology is one of those that's always been of interest to me. And I could see, especially from a corporate and an executive perspective, how important it is to understand that and actually, use that in what you're doing. Because so many people don't. And that's why there's so many bulls in a china shop running around, running over people and doing everything else, because they don't understand some of the basics of human psychology. And so that, and then taking things like David Hawkins' scale of consciousness, that thing that I got told, you are where your attention is. All these things just kind of started coalescing. And as I would sit with it. You can call it meditation, you can call it recapitulation, whatever. These almost like these things from the universe would come to me, and it's like, hey, take this and that and that and put them together and see what you got, right? And that's how I kind of came to it, on my own. Both from my independent learning, some trainings that I would go to, coaching programs I was part of, and it just kind of started coalescing for me that way.
That's interesting, because knowing you, I would not think of you being inside an organization, doing internal audit, doing things like that. Like, that just doesn't make any damn sense to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's I hung up the suits and the ties a long time ago, but yeah, I did that for a long time because I was very, very good at it, right? And I think for me too, when it gets back to happiness and kind of the journey that I've been on for really the last, I mean, most of my life, but since I left the corporate world to become more of a mentor and coach to people in corporate and do training more, that really started to change, probably 15 years ago or so, to where, I realized even though I was really good at that, there were other things that lit me up more. And I was always taught, you go to school, you get a good job, you work 40 years in that, and then you die, right? Sort of thing.
Yep.
You retire and die. And that was the path that I was on. I mean, I chose accounting. It was really easy for me. I actually had an accounting class in high school. It was the easiest class for me. It made total sense. Most people hated it, right?
Wow.
But I didn't want to be a general ledger accountant, right? And so when I went through college, we had a family friend who was actually a retired partner from Arthur Andersen. And I looked at him and I'm like, that's what I want to do. And so I went on and worked at Arthur Andersen, worked my way up there, and then Enron happened, right? And oh shit, the firm goes away. I moved to KPMG, and then it's like, that just wasn't quite right for me. And then one of my clients needed somebody to start an internal audit department for them. And so I did that, and I really enjoyed it. It's kind of fun work in that, because I'm an enigma and I like so many different things. Internal audit in a corporation is a fun job because you get to see all aspects of the corporation, right? So you're dealing with pretty much all the processes and risks associated with it. So you've got to have a good understanding of business, being able to work with executives, learning some of the corporate politics things along with the day job. But your projects are so varied as well, that it made it exciting for me, right? And exciting to, grow and develop a team and be able to kind of, uncover maybe some risks that people hadn't thought about, and help the organization that way. But, as I continued to move up in the organization, and the last role that I had was, my intention was to be a CEO. And I went to work for this particular company with the intention of becoming the CEO. Maybe not at the next round, because I wouldn't quite be ready for that, but the following one, that I would be one of those people in line. Until we got a new CEO, and he and I did not see eye to eye. And he had totally different ideas of where the company needed to go. And so I had one of these kind of crisis moments, in a ancient tradition standpoint. Some people might call it a shamanic death, where it's like you kind of, your belief or a lot of the stuff behind what you're doing in your life all of a sudden no longer makes sense, and you start to see the shedding of a lot of things. And it was at that point that I said, you know what, I've always enjoyed teaching and speaking, and I want to do more of that. And so instead of going and trying to find a new corporate job, I was like, nope, I'm going to start my own company. And, even still then, I'm working with a lot of people in audit and finance and accounting that are very conservative. So I would wear the tie. I went around the world in a bow tie and a fedora, for a long time.
I remember that.
You remember that phase of me,
Yep.
right? And so I did that for a long time, training people, and kind of naturally got into coaching executives because I'd done the head of internal audit, head of risk, head of compliance job, a few times, and have really, embraced that or built different businesses around that. But along the journey, it's like, am I living for me? Am I really who I am, or am I still living a life that somebody else expects me to live? Right. And so that's where really over the last 15 years, it's really been more and more shedding of that, right? To the point of got rid of the suit and tie. Screw that. I'm not doing that anymore. Right. I already at that time knew I like to wear hats. So I've been a hat guy for probably 20, 25 years, something like that. Right. Um, but slowly, little things as I would learn more about myself or try things on, all of a sudden, I realized that I was almost pretending or playing a role. And now I'm much more just being who I am. Right. And for me, a lot of times people, when they ask that question, it's like, well, look back at when you were a little kid. Right. What did you dream about as a little kid? What were you like as a teenager? Right. Because then we usually grow up and we adult and we become whoever society thinks we're supposed to be. Right. And so I kind of went back and forth. I like colorful things like you do. I have colorful shirts in there. Um, but when I was a teenager, I used to wear t-shirts a lot because I love t-shirts. So I'm back to wearing t-shirts. Right. And again, usually I like colorful, but hey, I found these black t-shirts that I really love. And hey, decision fatigue, you're going to see me in probably a black t-shirt almost all the time, but a different hat. Right. And I've started to stop caring what people think about me and giving up some of the beliefs that I was taught that I don't know are true, right? Like I was taught always to shave. And then one time, I had to have some things removed off my face, some pre little things, right? And so I couldn't shave for about a month. Um, and so my beard started growing out, and I'm like, huh, well, that's interesting. This is the first time I've actually had facial hair, right? And so it kind of healed up and it was ready to the point to where I could shave again. And my wife at the time was like, why don't you cut it in a goatee? I've never seen you in a goatee. And I'm like, okay. So I did that and I wore it that way for a long time. In fact, you can go back and see some of my videos from a few years ago. And I got this really long thing. I was trying to do
Yeah.
the ZZ Top thing, but it would just get all scraggly and everything else. And um, and so then it's like, well, do I keep doing that? Do I shave it all off? And I'm like, I think I'm going to try growing a beard and see what I think about that. So here I am, bearded now. And hey, who knows? 2 years from now, I may decide to shave it all off. I like it now. I think it feels more like who I am in a way, right? Who I am authentically, because I keep needling in there and trying to figure out, who is Jason. And this is something that's been around in the ancient traditions forever. One of the codes of conduct in Delphi was know thyself, right? And in a lot of spiritual practices, one of the things you are told you are to do while you're here on this earth is know thyself, right? And so I just keep knowing myself better and better and trying to think about, who am I living for, myself or somebody else? And, do I really like doing this, or am I just doing it because that's what I think I'm supposed to do? So anyway, but
So so how do you embrace all that though, Jason? There's so much there and so much uncertainty. How do you embrace that? And how do you make sure that that is truly you and that it isn't somebody else's wrapper that they're putting on you?
well, I think that's where when you get kind of silent with yourself and you just know, you feel in your heart, you feel in your gut. Right. So that's another thing that most of the time we all try to think cerebrally, just in our head. But you got to think about there's actually what a lot of people consider three brains in our body, our actual, what we call the brain in our head, but also our heart and our gut are also these feeling and thinking places. And that's why, there's little things that have made their way into the English language, like, what does your heart tell you to do? How's that feeling your gut? Oh, I've got a bad feeling about that. Some of those kinds of things, because those are also important areas, right? And I've always been one who, I academically, I've been taught to manage uncertainty. That's what risk management is, right? And so I've got analytical skills from that. But as you quit, or as you release fear, that can end up helping you to embrace the change, right? And so some things that I think have helped me embrace change quicker is to realize that I can always make a different choice, right? So that takes some of the fear away from it, because it's like, hey, if I want to grow a beard and I like it, fine. If I don't like it, I can always make another choice. I can cut it off, right? I can always do that. Same thing. So everybody has seen me in a hat, for a long time. So I'm going to do a little reveal here with Phil, right? Because for 25 years, I've been shaving my head, right? Not bald, but I would, cut it down all the way. And then just let it grow out a little bit. And every 3 or 4 weeks, I would actually just buzz my head off. Well, look at this. Jason's got a whole head of
Holy
hair.
cow, you got hair.
I know. Look at that, right? I've had hair the whole time. And people thought I was cutting it because I was going bald. Well, it wasn't that. I mean, some of it maybe I watched one of my brothers start to do a comb over, and I'm like, fuck that shit. I'm not going through that, right? So I cut it off, but also because I like to wear hats, right? I didn't want to have hat hair all the time. And so there was some practical stuff with it. And, but after 20 and 25 years of it, and, my new partner is like, why don't you let your hair grow out a little bit? I'm like, okay, why not? Why not try it on, right? What's the worst thing? I just cut it off again if I don't like it. Then I'm kind of liking it, so I might keep it. Who knows, right? But to me, some of that whole getting rid of some of the fear of whatever decision you can make a new one tomorrow. You can make a new one later today, right? We don't have to live with the choices that we make for a whole life. I mean, and I know some people would stop and say, well, no, that's not true, right? I mean, there's certain things. You get a tattoo, you got that for life. Well, do you? I mean, you can get them removed now, right? Oh, if you have a kid, right? Well, yeah, but parent-child relationships look different. So even though you've birthed another human being or helped participate in that, how that parent and child relationship can be whatever you or your child wants it to be. There's no set thing, right? So for me, that has helped me embrace change. And I'm one too that I don't like to suffer any more than I have to.
Talk to me about that. What does that mean? I don't like to suffer any more than I have to.
Yeah. So, in the Buddhist tradition, there's a lot of talk. The Buddha talked a lot about suffering, right? And trying to alleviate suffering in the world, both suffering of ourselves and suffering of other people. And a lot of that suffering happens when we're in those lower frequency emotions, right? Because we're beating ourselves up emotionally, spiritually, sometimes physically. I mean, some people self-mutilate, and that's a form of beating ourselves up too. But, when you think of it, that way, a lot of times we suffer because of our perception of it, right? And so, again, kind of from an ancient tradition idea, there's this thing called the shamanic death, which actually I referred to before, which is kind of a shedding of who you are and becoming a new person, if you will. So think of things like a phoenix, burning up and becoming a new bird, a snake, right, shedding its skin, right? There's lots of different analogies like this in our in nature as well. But these are things that also happen to us as humans, right? Because I'm a different person today than I was yesterday. And so one thing that I do is when I lay down to bed, I die so that in the morning I can wake up a new person as well, right? And so how this looks is most of the suffering in life happens for a couple of reasons. Either we're focused on the past, we're regretting the past of something that happened, or we're worried about the future, right? Because we're not in the present. So that's why a lot of people talk about mindfulness. And the more mindful we can be, right, the better that we actually are in being able to do what we need to do, right? And so that can lead to suffering. But also, what can lead to suffering is if we choose not to make changes in our life, right? Because there comes a point usually where most of us try to have a foot in one world and a foot in the other world. And this even kind of goes back to this whole idea of shamanic death. In that instance, a lot of the traditions teach that really what a shamanic death is you're crossing a bridge into the unknown, right? It's like Indiana Jones going across a rope bridge. Only as you're moving across that bridge, it disintegrates, and you kind of are cutting ties with the past, whoever you were, maybe past relationships, other things like that. And so what ends up happening is suffering often happens because we're doing the splits, right? The train is moving down the track and we've still got one foot on the ground, and that hurts, right? And so we can choose to make that suffering last longer if we want to and continue to try to have both feet in two different places, right? That's the whole cognitive dissonance in psychology, trying to hold two differing beliefs at the same time. You can't do it, right? Or it makes you go crazy. Literally, what we would call, psychologically crazy if you try to hold those two things. And so, what I have just chosen to do that works for me is when it's time to jump, I jump and I don't look back, right? One of my favorite lyrics is Supertramp from Goodbye Stranger. If I never look behind me, my troubles will be few. Now, some people, may look at that and may not understand that, I'm either all in or I'm gone. It's kind of like one of my favorite scenes is from Good Will Hunting, where Matt Damon just doesn't show up to pick up Ben that one day for work. He doesn't even say goodbye. He's just gone, right? And some people look at that and think, well, sometimes I'm harsh or I can be hard because when I cut something out of my life or I cut people out of my life, it's because I've moved on and they haven't, right? And I don't try to drag them with me, but they're no longer a part of my reality going forward. And so to some people that looks callous, like, oh my gosh, what an asshole, right? But it's like, well, no, you have your life. You need to go live your life. I need to go live my life. And they're two different things now. And I can't be in both places at one time. I choose not to be in both places at the same time because that's that stretching, right? That's increases suffering longer than it needs to. It's kind of like just rip the band off, right? Instead of going, a little bit, just rip that sucker off. And, I think we can see this in a lot of things. There's a lot of, I'm in Northern Arizona now and there's cactus everywhere. Right. And so when you're walking the dog, depends on where he goes. And he got something in his harness. And so all of a sudden I was like, man, my finger feels kind of funny. And I looked down and I got a big old, prod in my skin. Well, at that point I could just sit there and look at it and go, oh, it kind of tickles. That feels a little weird. And I could just leave it there. Right. And if I just leave it there, if I let it break off in my skin and I just leave it there for a week or two, what's going to happen? It's probably going to get infected, right? It's going to swell up. Or I can look at it and go, well, bye-bye, and move on, right? And so it's that way with emotions, with relationships, with beliefs that we have as well. And I know it's often not easy. It's one of the hardest things to do is to kind of go against some things that you've been taught your whole life that are right. But the older I've gotten, and the more I've thought about it and looked at it, most of the things that we're actually taught are not true. In fact, things like history, most of the things in the history book didn't happen exactly the way they are portrayed, right? Because history is always written by the victors, right? And so because of that, they tend to leave their mark on history in the way that they would like it to be viewed instead of what actually happened. So, and I've been going, so I'm going to shut up. I'm going to pause for a minute.
No, it's just very interesting and very deep. And yet I think there's a lot there that we can learn from. The whole choice, I think, is a big thing. I mean, I believe happiness is a choice. I know you do as well.
Yep.
So how do we get started on this journey, Jason? I mean, if you were to, let's pretend that I'm your little coaching client here, and I'm saying, okay, coach, where do I start? How do I get started on this journey towards being more enlightened and finding more happiness?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most practical and easy things for people to do is a little practice that I try to do every time I become aware. Right. So that's the first thing is you have to start placing more awareness on wanting to do this and seeing what's actually going on. Right. I mean, any 12-step programs, the first step is always acknowledgement. Right. And so until we're aware or we acknowledge that we want something to change, we can't even see it. Right. And so that's kind of the first step is you've got to want to do this and you've got to want to start placing your awareness on it. Right. And then you just start checking in with yourself and seeing how you're actually feeling emotionally, right? Because again, how these feelings and emotions that we have in our body, they're very deep as well. And even from a spiritual perspective, that we could go down a huge rabbit hole on that. But to think in general terms, every emotion is based on a specific frequency and vibration that's even going on in your body, right? And so you can feel, when you're sad, when you're angry, when you're grateful, right? When you're feeling courageous, right? These are all words that I think most of us, for the most part, kind of understand those terms, right? And so start checking in with yourself and thinking about, hey, why am I so pissed off today? Right. And this happens to me. I mean, it happened yesterday and this last week, where all of a sudden it's like, man, I'm in a little bit of a funk and I don't know why I am maybe a little agitated or feeling annoyed. Right. And so then I just stop and it's not like I go and meditate for 4 hours to figure this out. I do this very quick because I just ask myself questions. Why am I feeling annoyed? And I stop and I try to think, real quick about what are some of the different things that have happened that maybe triggered me, move me down that emotional scale so where I'm feeling annoyed. Right. And it's like, well, why is that? And if I can kind of figure out what it is, right, then I do this little exchange in my head, which is I release and I replace. I release and I replace, which is kind of what I talked about before. But there's an important part of letting go, forgiving ourselves, forgiving others. But when you let something go, there's a vacuum. And so if you let go of something without replacing it with something, then who knows what else is going to creep in, right? I could replace my feelings of annoyance, but if I don't actively replace that with something else, anger could just pop in there, right? And so I have to be conscious and actually thinking about what I'm going to replace it with. And so that's what I do, right? And I sit there and just to have integrity, I look at like some of the things that happened that made me annoyed the last day or two, I realized, oh, well, maybe I didn't handle this relationship the way I should have. Right. I did some things that I need to go uh, correct. So maybe I need to go and ask for forgiveness, provide an apology. And so if that's something I need to do, then I go and do it, and I do it as quick as I can, because again, I don't want I don't want my legs stretched out, right? I want to do it as quick as I can. And so then again, I go through kind of that process like we talked about earlier in the video. Okay, I'm annoyed. I release the feelings of being annoyed, and I replace that with gratitude. I usually go to gratitude because for me, it's just simple and easy and quick to do, right? I'm grateful that I got triggered and that I was aware of and know that I was annoyed, that I was aware that I was annoyed. And I'm grateful, right, that I have the skills to be able to move me to a different place, right? And again, maybe a lot of times that apology is also includes a message of appreciation as well for the person, right? It depends on on the circumstance. And again, this could be with someone else, but it also could be with us. Because one thing I always teach my coaching clients is every time you want to point a finger at somebody, guess what? Throw your back at you, right? And so most of the time, a lot of times it's us forgiving ourselves. It's us being compassionate with ourselves as well, right? Because a lot of times when I feel annoyed, it's because I feel like I haven't performed as well as I could have, right? And so I'm annoyed at myself that maybe I didn't do everything I could have done, or I didn't do it in quite the way that I wanted it to be done, or I planned something out and it didn't quite go the way I was intending it to. And it's like, right. But again, I can stop and I can release those feelings and I can be grateful, right? Because a lot of times, Garth Brooks, thank God for unanswered prayers, right? That's a great song. And, how grateful should we be when things don't go the way that we think they should? Because often we learn something, somebody comes into our life, we find something new, we see the world differently than we would have, we experience something that we never would have experienced before if we just actually, go with it instead of feeling annoyed. And so that's why, again, you are where your attention is. You want to feel annoyed? You want to stay feeling annoyed? You want to stay angry? Or do you want to feel something else? Do you want to feel happy? Do you want to feel grateful? Do you want to feel love? Right? Some of these other emotions that are better for us as human beings.
Right on. Right on. And I think that's a great place to stop for this time anyway, because we could talk for the rest of the day and still barely cover this. But I love your last line there. You are where your attention is. So friends, if you're looking to get started on this journey, think about what you're looking at. What are you focused on? Where is your attention? You are where your attention is. If you want to get more from my friend Jason Mefford, go to jasonmefford.com. That's Jason, Jason. Mefford is MEFFORD.com. Jason's got 3 cool podcasts, Jamming with Jason, which talks a lot about the music that he's into, Walking the Spiritual Path, which is a lot of what we talked about today, and then a cool podcast that he does with Dr. Kathy Groover.
Dr. Kathy.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy Groover, right? That's all about the difference between fire and earth and all those different things. So Jason, this was great, man. Thanks for your time and for your insight and for reminding me that you are where your attention is.
Well, thank you